respective countries who have played a leadership role in such a major addition and enhancement of the Montreal Protocol. The Kigali Amendment was approved last October by all 197 parties to the Montreal Protocol and led by the Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister McKenna, who have advocated ratification and worked for it around the world. I understand that you're pretty close today, and I strongly endorse, as one of the original players in the original protocol, this important step forward on climate change. For Canada, the ratification of the amendment and the reduction of HFC emissions will help us meet our targets under the Paris Agreement, reducing emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. In that important sense, the road to Montreal was a difficult one and a challenging one. But now the road to Paris runs straight through Montreal, and you're on a highway of success. Thanks to your leadership. It's not done yet, but you've got a real good leg up on some of the challenges that you have to confront. The will and the votes to make that happen are in this room. Make no mistake at all, it was the political will to make it happen in the light of alarming empirical evidence of ozone depletion that drove the Montreal Protocol to its successful conclusion 30 years ago. You all know full well that if the Prime Minister or the President of your governments around the world considers the environment as a throwaway issue to be looked at as a minor portfolio in government as opposed to one of the top and most important agencies that serve people, you're not going to get the successful conclusion. But I'm delighted to see that most prime ministers and presidents now place it at the top of the heap. Number one on the hit parade. And that's the least they can do, because we're talking about a magnificent legacy for our children and grandchildren, as opposed to damage to the vital infrastructure of human life. So this is called leadership. At the time, there was general agreement on the problem, but no consensus on a solution. But there were two obvious imperatives: political engagement and the involvement of industry as part of the solution. Both were key elements in the successful negotiations that resulted in the Montreal Protocol. Leadership at the national level and coordinated leadership at the international level, particularly in the global forum of the UN. Leadership doesn't mean telling people what they want to hear. Leadership means telling people what they have to know. And what they have to know are the facts that have been laid out by Minister McKenna here today, and with which you are all so familiar in your own professional lives. Even the science was contested in some political precincts way back when. Does that sound familiar? In terms of today's conversation on climate change, there were deniers there as well, even when confronted with a visible hole in the sky. I should say this about my friend President Ronald Reagan, that he overcame his initial skepticism, for example, about acid rain, to work with us in developing an approach to dealing with it. On March 11th, 1981, when Ronald Reagan visited Ottawa for the first time as president, he was greeted by tens and tens and tens of thousands of protesters on Parliament Hill. They shouted and waved placards that conveyed a single powerful message: stop, stop acid rain. Canadians were literally shouting at the rain. 10 years later, almost to the day, on March 13th, 1991, the first President Bush and I signed the acid rain accord in the center block on Parliament Hill, there wasn't a protester in sight. I regarded acid rain in those days and the environment as a litmus test of the value and the effectiveness of the Canadian-American relationship, and said so to both Presidents Reagan and Bush on many, many occasions. In fact, on a visit to Ottawa in 1987, then Vice President Bush famously said that I got an absolute earful on acid rain from Prime Minister Mulroney over lunch. He certainly did. And that's what did it. When President Reagan signaled that to his own administration, only if you have been seated in the Oval Office and watched the incredible reaction that takes place with American, high-placed American functionaries, that you see how vital it is to have the President of the United States on side in any important international action. And it'll all come in the fullness of time. But even as we were talking to the Americans, we were taking action with the provinces and industry, implementing what I call the clean hands policy of leading from the front. Even before the Shamrock Summit in February of 1985, and only 6 months after taking office, we had already persuaded the 7 provinces east of Saskatchewan to agree to reduce their sulfur dioxide emissions to 50% below 1980 levels by 1994 to 2.3 million tons. The Clean Hands narrative also gave us moral leverage when I had the high honor of addressing a joint session of the United States Congress in April 1988. As I told the American legislators, we have concluded agreements with our provinces to reduce acid rain emissions in eastern Canada to half their 1980 levels by 1994. But I continued in talking to the American legislators. That's only half the solution, because the other half comes from you. The other half of acid rain comes from across our border, directly from the United States, falling upon our forests, killing our lakes, and soiling our cities. And I continued, we acknowledge our responsibility. On behalf of Canada, I acknowledge our responsibility for some of the acid rain that falls on the United States. Our exports of acid rain to the U.S. will have been cut in excess of 50%, and we are asking nothing more than this from you. And I left the Congress in my final statement with this question. What would be said of a generation of North Americans who found a way to explore the stars, but allowed their lakes and forests and rivers and streams to languish and die? Well, not only was the dispute over acid rain resolved, the problem was solved. A quarter century later, we have answered the question. We have not allowed our lakes, rivers, streams, and forests to languish and die. Acid rain is no longer an issue in protecting our environment and our quality of life. We answered the call. And if I could say one thing from all of that experience, always remember, history will judge you and all of us, not on the speeches we make, but on the results we deliver. And in that, the Montreal Protocol has delivered big time. And I congratulate the minister and her prime minister and all of you for making this possible, and I congratulate you publicly today. The present government, under the leadership of the Prime Minister and Minister McKenna, has also answered the call, beginning with the Paris Agreement in December 2015. The government is also phasing in a carbon price over 5 years, beginning in 2018, except for Quebec and Ontario, which have created cap and trade markets, while also approving the proposed twinning of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipelines. The environment and energy are not competitive. They are complementary public policy issues. As I said to the US Congress nearly 30 years ago, they are not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. Canada has the third largest proven reserves of oil in the world, and we're not about to let 170 billion barrels of oil stay in the ground. But we need to extract the resource and transport it to tidewater in an environmentally sustainable manner. And the energy industry in Alberta has already made significant strides in this regard. And I know that Canadians have the ingenuity to do the rest. Allow me to conclude on a personal note on climate change and global warming. The Bible says that young men have visions and old men dream dreams. Well, great countries and great organizations like this require a combination of both. A vision of where will you leave us 50 years from now, and the dream of a better tomorrow in the environment for our children and grandchildren as well. The science is incontrovertible, and the evidence is before our eyes every day. In the wildfires that have raged in the forests of Alberta, British Columbia, and California, and the hurricanes incubated in the warming waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico that have devastated Texas and Louisiana and Puerto Rico and the US and British Virgin Islands. The United Nations Weather Agency says that 2017 is set to become the world's third warmest year on record, behind only 2015 and 2016, when record temperatures were driven by El Nino. In other words, the last 3 years of our existence will go down as the warmest in the history of the world. Pretty stark warning. Pretty compelling evidence. Pretty incontrovertible arguments. So while there is much to celebrate on this auspicious anniversary, there is also much to be vigilant about. Minister McKenna has taken up the good fight on behalf of all Canadians as a champion of the environment on behalf of us all. In this, and I hope it reflects a sentiment not limited to Canada, in this, party or partisan lines should be minimized as much as humanly possible. We are all on the same side, determined to leave a better world and a more pristine environment to our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren. It is the least we can do. In the spirit of the Montreal Protocol, let's get to work right here and right now. Thank you very much.